The story of Jezebel is one of the most fascinating and controversial in the Bible, intertwined with political intrigue, religious conflict, and the destiny of a nation. The biblical narrative describes her as a ruthless figure, whose name has become synonymous with corruption, idolatry, and lust. However, to truly understand the impact of this woman on the kingdom of Israel, it's essential to delve into the historical and cultural context that shaped her and sent her on a mission that would challenge the very foundation of monotheistic faith. Jezebel's journey begins in the year 900 BC, yes, on the gleaming shores of the Mediterranean Sea, in one of the most admired and mysterious civilizations of the ancient world, Phoenicia. This was the home of audacious merchants and legendary sailors who mastered the art of navigation, extending their influence from their powerful city-states to the ends of the known world. Among them, two cities shone with special power, Tyre and Sidon. They were proud urban jewels of Phoenicia, with busy ports, markets saturated with spices, gold and incense, and temples that exuded the dark aroma of paganism. In these cities, opulence and idolatry were not opposites, but allies. Commerce funded worship, and worship legitimized power. The Phoenician gods, led by Baal, the god of storm and fertility, and Astarte, the goddess of love and war, reigned over the spiritual life of the people. The soul of Phoenicia was tinged with shadows, reflecting the complex web of power, religion, and wealth that characterized it. It was in Sidon, the most prominent of the northern cities, that the figure who would forever change the course of the kingdom of Israel emerged, Etbaal. His name, which in the Phoenician language meant Baal is with him or Baal is with me, was already a harbinger of his destiny. Etbaal was not born king, he became king through ambition. This priest of the cult of Astarte was not satisfied with the altar, he yearned for the throne. With cunning and violence, he assassinated King Felis and proclaimed himself ruler of the Sidonians. It was a precise, bloody and decisive coup that merged political and spiritual power, making him a priest and monarch, a leader of men, and a guide of obscure cults. Under Etbaal's rule, Sidon became a center of idolatry like never before. The temples grew in number and splendor, and statues of Astarte, with her sensual and deadly face, appeared on every corner. The cult degenerated into forbidden rituals, sacred orgies, child sacrifices, and blood covenants. Etbaal was not a mere participant. He was the architect of the entire religious system, the high priest of institutionalized sin. But Etbaal was not satisfied with what he had already achieved. He had a dream of extending his influence beyond the coasts of Phoenicia, of aligning neighboring powers under a single spiritual, political, and deeply pagan vision. He wanted to build a religious empire where Baal would be worshipped from Tyre to Samaria, and it was amidst this dream of greatness that his firstborn daughter was born in the golden halls of the palace of Sidon. Between fine linen curtains and columns carved with sacred symbols, Etbaal silently watched the newborn girl. He took her firmly, brought her close to his chest, and with a solemn, almost ritualistic voice, spoke her name, Jezebel. A name of Phoenician origin full of mystery and meaning. Some associate it with the exaltation of Baal, where the ancient invocation, "Where is the prince?" is uttered in temples, a cry that seeks the manifestation of an absent god or the arrival of a new one. For Etbaal, however, it was not just a name, it was a destiny. He not only recognized her as his heir, but also consecrated her as an instrument of spiritual conquest. She was not just his daughter, she was his legacy. From birth, Jezebel was not raised as an ordinary child. She did not experience the innocent games of other daughters of the nobility, nor was she surrounded by lullabies that expressed tenderness or compassion. From her earliest days, she was immersed in the dense aroma of Phoenician incense, the hypnotic chants of the priests of Astarte and Melkart, and the living shadows of the temples, where consecrated virgins danced and oracles were uttered in hushed tones. Etbaal, her father, saw her as a divine project. He knew that nations could be subdued more easily by faith than by the sword. Therefore, Jezebel was his most carefully sculpted gem. From a very young age, he exposed her to the most complex rituals, the protocol of worship and public speeches. Her education was not merely courtly, it was both sacred and political. She learned the languages of merchants, the secrets of persuasion, the history of neighboring dynasties, sacred astrology, and the art of unarmed warfare. While other girls learned embroidery or nursery rhymes, Jezebel watched sacrifices, listened to treaties, and participated in banquets where ambassadors from Egypt, Hatti, and Tyre discussed routes and alliances. Her room was decorated with maps of the Mediterranean and effigies of ancient gods, and her nurse was a retired priestess who whispered obscure stories to her. Jezebel did not grow up to obey, but to dominate. In her adolescence, her beauty began to inspire fear rather than admiration. She had a gaze that never wavered. Her eyes, like bright embers, were held back by a veil of elegance. Her voice, trained in the psalms of the temples, could both seduce and command. She did not need to raise her voice to assert her authority. All she had to do was speak, and her father's counselors fell silent. Her passage through the palace corridors became a ceremony. She knew when to reveal herself and when to remain unseen, when to smile and when to keep her face impassive. It was during these years that she began to weave her web of influence in the heart of the Sidonian palace, not by invading the halls of power, but by waiting, observing, and slowly penetrating the circles where the kingdom's destiny was decided. She won the trust of the most experienced priests, brilliantly interpreting omens and reciting sacred texts with precision. She captivated merchants and emissaries with her knowledge of the language of the sea and the value of spices, wine, and gold. She won over the people not with arms, but with her presence, appearing in processions as a living incarnation of the goddess, dressed in purple linen and covered in imported perfumes. Etbaal watched it all with a mixture of pride and calculation. He had built a temple with stones and human hands, but with Jezebel, he was building a living temple, an altar with a human face, from which to manipulate the destinies of entire peoples. As a princess, Jezebel did not need a throne to rule. Her power did not come from a crown, but from her influence. While Etbaal governed the kingdom from the throne, Jezebel shaped it from the spirit, the temples, and the symbols. Her name was spoken with respect in the streets, with fear at the altars, and with admiration in foreign courts. And yet Jezebel did not just look at Sidon. From the palace balconies, her gaze turned south, toward a divided land with a new king in Samaria, an unstable kingdom, and an even greater throne to conquer. Her ambition was not limited to the heart of Sidon. She was destined to be a key player in the destiny of the Mediterranean. And then, on a memorable day, the winds of the Mediterranean brought with them the aroma of incense and salt. An unusual procession descended from the north. The royal caravan of Israel, led by the young king Ahab, son of Omri, advanced toward Sidon with a purpose not limited to commerce. He sought treaties as well as legitimacy, expansion, and an open door to the world on the other side of the sea. His father had built the first diplomatic bridges with Phoenicia. Now it was his turn to cross them. From the moment the Israelite chariots crossed the gates of Sidon, the reception was majestic. Priests walked ahead, sprinkling sacred perfumes. Musicians played drums and cymbals, and dancers wove figures with their bodies. The crowd gathered in the streets not only out of respect for the foreign guest, but because they knew that day would not be just another one in the history of Sidon. The son of Omri came hungry for the sea, and Etbaal was waiting for him with a set table and a move already calculated. But it was upon entering the royal palace that Ahab realized he was not simply in a diplomatic court. Inside, the walls were not adorned with battle scenes or portraits of kings. What dominated the place were the gods. Statues of Baal flanked the columns like silent sentinels. The palace was not just a royal residence, it was a sanctuary. There, political power and religion intertwined like the roots of a single tree. Etbaal, dressed with the dignity of a king and the authority of a priest, descended to receive him. For 3 days, negotiations proceeded at a meticulous pace. Etbaal offered preferential access to Phoenician ports, maritime protection, cedar wood, wine, and artisans. Israel, in turn, would provide what Sidon needed most: grain, oil, cattle, and drinking water. A pact seemed inevitable. However, while the treaties were advancing, Etbaal waited for the opportune moment to reveal his true condition. He didn't just want a commercial agreement. He wanted an irreversible union. And on the 4th day, during a banquet in the inner gardens of the palace, the Phoenician king spoke. "King Ahab," he said calmly, "the numbers are on the table, the routes are marked, but treaties signed with ink can be undone. If we want a pact that will withstand the test of time, it must be sealed with blood, with a true union. I offer you my daughter Jezebel, princess of Sidon, as your wife. With her, this agreement will be eternal." Ahab paled. The name Jezebel was familiar to him. He knew she was no ordinary girl. Accepting her as his wife would not simply mean accepting a woman. It would mean accepting an influence, a worldview. He respectfully asked for time to deliberate. That night, the deliberation room was filled with silence and tension. Ahab expressed the complexity of the decision to his counselors. "Sidon opens the doors of the sea to us. She offers us wealth, protection, and a future. But with Jezebel, something else happens. What will the prophets think? What will Elijah say?" Upon hearing that name, the counselors exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one dared to deny the power of the prophet's voice. However, one of Ahab's closest men broke the silence. "Majesty, with all due respect, Elijah does not rule, you rule. What is more valuable, the disapproval of a prophet or the prosperity of a nation? With this union, Israel will grow. Samaria will become a center of commerce, a stable throne. The people need grain, not warnings, peace, not fire." The others nodded, some out of conviction, while others did so out of fear of being left behind by history. Ahab listened, reflected, and before dawn his decision was made. The next day he appeared before Etbaal, his face resolute and his voice firm. "I accept. I will make Jezebel my wife, and with you, king of Sidon, I will seal an alliance that no enemy can break." Etbaal gave a slight smile, as if he had been expecting this answer all along. He ordered the scribes to seal the treaties, and the priests invoked the blessing of the gods. Then he ordered the doors of the hall to be opened, and then she entered, Jezebel. She walked with a firm step, dressed in dark blue linen, embroidered with gold, with her hair in long braids. She did not come as a guarantee of an agreement. She came as an equal, as someone who knew who she was. Her eyes met Ahab's. In that instant, without a word, both understood that the pact would not just be between kingdoms, but between destinies. Etbaal took his daughter's hand and placed it in Ahab's. "Here is Sidon," he said, "in blood, in wisdom, and in fire. Treat her as queen, and your kingdom will remain unshaken." Jezebel did not speak, but her silence was louder than many speeches. She looked around as if she were already measuring the ground. She knew it wouldn't be long before she left her mark. That afternoon, Ahab asked Etbaal for a moment alone with Jezebel. They walked together through one of the palace's inner courtyards. "Princess," Ahab said, "what do you expect from this pact?" Jezebel looked at him directly. "I hope it will be more than a pact, my lord. I hope it will be a kingdom where we both rule. You know the sword and the field. I know the altar and the word. Together, we can make Israel a kingdom that nations will not forget." Intrigued, Ahab asked, "In Israel, we worship Yahweh, the God of our fathers. Are you not afraid that your faith in Baal will be disapproved of?" Jezebel smiled faintly. "I do not fear what I do not know, and I know that where there is prosperity, people open their hearts. Let me bring my altars and my priests, and soon Samaria will be stronger and richer than you ever dreamed." Ahab observed the gleam in Jezebel's eyes. It was not the gleam of a woman asking for permission, but the gleam of someone who already felt she was a part of what she was about to build. "We will leave at dawn," he said at last. "Samaria will receive you as queen." "And I," she replied without averting her gaze, "will receive Samaria as mine." At dawn, the caravan began its return to Israel. It was not just a wedding procession, it was a diplomatic, spiritual, and political procession. Jezebel did not travel alone. She was accompanied by priests, musicians, scribes, images of Astarte, incense, and sacred scrolls. She was not just changing residence, she was bringing the entirety of her culture and religion with her. The villages they passed through stopped to watch. Peasants, intrigued by the woman of majestic stature, murmured among themselves, while the rumor of her arrival spread faster than the caravan itself. When the walls of Samaria appeared in the distance, the people were already gathered at the gates to witness her entry. There was astonishment on their faces. Some bowed, others looked on with suspicion. When Ahab and Jezebel crossed the palace gates, the court gathered. The king, with a firm voice, announced to the nobles and priests, "Today I present to you Jezebel, princess of Sidon. From this day forward, she will be my wife and your queen. With her arrival, we seal an alliance that will bring prosperity and greatness to Israel." He had barely finished saying these words when an uneasy murmur arose in the corridor. All eyes turned to the front door, where a man dressed in a rough camel's hair cloak and a leather belt entered unannounced. His steps were firm, and his eyes were like fire. Everyone recognized him, Elijah, a prophet of Yahweh. His voice resonated in the hall, cutting through the air like a sword. "Is this what you will do, O King of Israel? You will unite your house with those who worship Baal and raise altars to other gods? You were appointed to guide Israel in righteousness, not to lead them astray into idolatry. Do you forget that the Lord gave you this throne? No alliance can bring peace when the king's heart turns away from the living God. As surely as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, this alliance will bring weight and judgment upon your house." Ahab frowned. "Elijah, prophet, I seek peace and prosperity for my people. This alliance will open our doors to commerce. Does Yahweh take pleasure in poverty and isolation?" Elijah did not lower his gaze. "The Lord delights in an upright heart. And I warn you, O king, what you think is profit now, you will soon see as loss. You have opened the door, and through it will enter not only riches, but also foreign altars and hands stained with innocent blood." The silence was absolute. Jezebel, who had been standing beside Ahab, turned her face and stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Who is this man who dares to speak to you like that on your own throne?" she asked in a low voice. "It is Elijah," Ahab replied almost in a whisper, "a prophet of Yahweh, the God of Israel." Jezebel did not take her eyes off him, but her lips curled into a slight smile that hid more than it showed. "Then," she said, "it will be interesting to see which of the two reigns in this land." Elijah turned and left, leaving behind a heavy silence that no one dared to break. The wedding took place a few days later. Israelite and Phoenician priests stood on either side, while the people watched. When the engagement was announced, trumpets sounded and the people applauded, mixing emotion and uncertainty in a single cheer. The next day, Ahab ordered a second throne to be built next to his, a throne of cedar inlaid with ivory and adorned with golden lions. He wanted Jezebel to sit beside him, not behind him, and for every visitor to understand that the queen shared authority. From then on, all audiences in Samaria were under the supervision of two rulers, Ahab, the heir of Omri, and Jezebel, the daughter of Etbaal, whose influence was beginning to spread throughout Israel. Their union produced 3 children, Ahaziah, Jehoram, and Athaliah. The latter, following the same spirit as her mother, would one day reign over Judah. Jezebel's first days in Samaria were of calculated observation. She did not rush into drastic changes, but every step she took seemed to have a purpose. She presented herself generously to the people, distributing gifts from Sidon. This carefully planned gesture won the affection of many, especially noble women who soon began to imitate her style. Thus, even before she uttered a word about her gods, she had already won the admiration of a large part of the city. In particular, her influence reached the king's heart. In slow and subtle conversations, Jezebel began to tell him about Baal, the lord of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the mother of life. She presented her cult as a secure source of abundance, a tangible path to guaranteed harvests, livestock, and prosperity. "In Sidon, our prayers do not rise into the void," she said softly. "Our gods are here among us. We can look upon their faces, and they respond with rain and abundance. They do not hide. They do not remain invisible like the God you worship. A God who is not seen is silent." Convinced by her counsel and seduced by the promise of prosperity, Ahab ordered an altar to Baal to be built in Samaria. The best artisans were summoned, and an imposing structure was erected in the central square, with columns of carved stone and an image of the god. Jezebel also convinced the king that Asherah should have a place of honor. In a sacred garden, a carved wooden image of cedar was erected. Phoenician priests, brought from Sidon, were assigned to officiate the rituals, and everything was organized so that the worship of these gods would be integrated into the life of the kingdom. With the altars already built, Jezebel turned her attention to the court. At banquets and private meetings, she described the rituals and rewards that these gods granted to those who honored them. The nobility, fascinated by the splendor of the temples, began to participate in the rites. Then it was the people's turn. Jezebel, with a firm voice and simple language, promised that if Israel honored Baal and Asherah, the rains would come on time, the harvests would be abundant, and families would prosper. Her words, supported by the king's approval and the participation of the nobility, found an immediate echo. What was initially curiosity turned into a habit and then into devotion. Over time, the idolatry took on an even darker and more perverse face. On full moon nights, the altar courtyards were filled with songs and dances that culminated in ritual orgies. The priests encouraged the debauchery, proclaiming that carnal pleasure brought the gods' blessing. But the most atrocious was reserved for the days of greatest festivity, human sacrifices. Amidst deafening drums and frantic chants, children were offered to Baal, placed in the gleaming arms of his bronze statue. The smoke and the stench of burnt flesh rose over the city, and the screams were muffled by the crowd's clamor, who believed that this would guarantee rain and prosperity. Thus, all of Israel gave themselves over to corruption disguised as worship. The people were plunged into the shadow of foreign gods, covered in smoke, blood, and shame. It was then that the voice of a man rose in the midst of that darkness. The prophet Elijah, sent by Yahweh, traveled through villages and squares, warning the people about the judgment that would come if they did not return to the God of their fathers. "Return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," he cried out. "He is the only living God. Your idols have eyes but do not see. Turn away from the abomination before the land closes up and the rain no longer falls." But his words fell on hardened ground. Jezebel, hearing rumors about the prophet, secretly despised him, considering him a minor obstacle. One day, Elijah decided to go to the heart of the problem, the palace. He crossed the gates of Samaria and stood before King Ahab. "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand," he said in a grave voice, "there will be neither dew nor rain in these years, except at my word. This is because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." Silence took over the room. Ahab, surprised, could barely respond with a gesture of disbelief. Jezebel, watching from an inner balcony, frowned with disdain. But Elijah did not wait for a response. He turned and left, leaving an invisible weight in the air that no one could shake. Weeks passed, and the prophet's warning began to come true. The sky closed up like an iron gate. There was no rain or morning dew. The rivers began to lower, the fields cracked under the scorching sun, and the livestock fell exhausted on the dry land. Jezebel, restless but still defiant, ordered special rituals to be performed for Baal. The priests danced day and night, and Jezebel, dressed in her ceremonial robes, climbed the altar, raising her hands toward the bronze statue. "O Baal, Lord of the clouds, send your rain upon this land," she cried out. But the sky remained motionless, cloudless, as if mocking her plea. Months turned into years, 3.5 years without a drop of water. The cisterns were dry, the fields covered in dust, and famine began to devour the homes. The people's murmur turned into a bitter cry. "Baal doesn't answer. Jezebel lied to us." In the squares and palace corridors, people began to remember Elijah's words. But Jezebel, furious at the growing distrust, hardened her heart even more, swearing that the prophet would pay for humiliating her. The famine in Samaria was unbearable. It was then that Elijah, moved by the word of God, appeared before King Ahab. The king's face showed the tension of a ruler whose authority was disintegrating. "King of Israel," Elijah said firmly, "now summon all the people, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Let everyone come up with me to Mount Carmel, and there we will know who the true God is." Ahab, with no options, sent messengers. Soon Mount Carmel was filled with crowds. Hungry peasants, nobles in worn clothes, exhausted soldiers, and in front the priests of Baal and Asherah. Elijah stepped forward, his lonely figure contrasting with the crowd. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if it is Baal, follow him." The people remained silent. Elijah proposed the test. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, but no human fire. The God who answers with fire, he will be the true God. The prophets of Baal began from morning until noon, dancing, shouting, and cutting themselves with knives while crying out, "Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice. Elijah, with a calmness that irritated his opponents, told them, "Shout louder! Perhaps your God is meditating or has some work to do. Perhaps he is sleeping." Hours passed, and the altar of Baal remained cold. Then Elijah repaired the altar of the Lord, placed the wood and the sacrifice on it, and had them fill 4 jars with water and pour them out 3 times over the burnt offering, until the water ran around it and filled the trench. He raised his hands to heaven and prayed, "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so that this people may know that you, Lord, are the true God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you." Then fire from the Lord came down and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. The terrified people fell on their faces, shouting, "Yahweh is God! Yahweh is God!" Elijah did not hesitate. "Seize the prophets of Baal, let none escape." They took them to the valley of Kishon, and there Elijah killed them. Then the prophet went up to the top of Carmel, prostrated himself, and put his face between his knees. 7 times he told his servant to look toward the sea, and on the 7th time the servant said, "I see a small cloud like a man's hand rising from the sea." Elijah got up and said, "Go, tell Ahab, get your chariot ready and go down so that the rain does not stop you." In a few minutes the sky darkened with clouds and wind, and great rain fell on the thirsty land. Ahab, drenched by the storm, ran back to Samaria. When he arrived at the palace, he found Jezebel waiting for news. "Did Baal answer?" she asked in a tone that mixed curiosity and authority. Ahab, his voice tense, reported everything that had happened: the prophet's humiliation, the fire that came down from heaven, and how Elijah had massacred them. Every word was a blow that fueled Jezebel's anger even more. Her lips curled into a cold smile, and her eyes turned to steel. "May the gods punish me without mercy," she said, "if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." The message was sent without delay. When Elijah received it, he felt the weight of the threat. His heart tightened, and he decided to flee. Months passed, and the spiritual tension in Israel persisted. Ahab's heart, dominated by Jezebel, became increasingly insensitive to the voice of Yahweh. It was then that a new episode revealed the extent of the queen's ambition and cruelty. In Jezreel, next to the king's palace, there was a beautiful vineyard, carefully tended by a man named Naboth. Ahab coveted it. One day he proposed to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard to use as a garden, and I will give you a better one, or if you prefer, its price in money." But Naboth, faithful to the law of his fathers, replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." Ahab returned to the palace dejected, hungry, and with a somber expression. Jezebel found him and said in a tone of disdain, "Are you now the king of Israel? Get up, eat, and be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth." Without waiting for a response, Jezebel devised a plan. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with the royal seal, and sent them to the elders of Naboth's city, ordering that a fast be proclaimed and that Naboth be accused of cursing God and the king by two scoundrels. The sentence was implicit, death by stoning, and so it was done. The people, deceived, led Naboth outside the city and stoned him to death. Upon receiving the news, Jezebel went to tell Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard that Naboth refused to give you, for Naboth is no longer alive. He is dead." Ahab went down to take possession, believing the matter was closed, but Naboth's blood cried out from the ground, and God had already sent his prophet to confront the king. Elijah found Ahab in the vineyard. "You have found me, my enemy." Ahab spat with a mixture of contempt and fear. "I have found you," Elijah replied, "because you have sold yourself to do what the Lord disapproves of. Do you think that Naboth's blood does not cry out from this land? Thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will lick up your blood." The silence was as heavy as lead. Elijah continued, "Behold, I will bring evil upon you and sweep away your descendants. As for Jezebel, the dogs will devour her by the wall of Jezreel." Ahab swallowed hard, feeling every word penetrate his flesh. His shoulders slumped and his pride crumbled like an old wall. With a dejected face he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and fasted. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring the disaster in his days. In the days of his son I will bring disaster upon his house." When Ahab returned to the palace, his face was marked by the weight of Elijah's words. He found Jezebel sitting on her throne. "What did that prophet tell you?" she asked. Ahab looked at her with a weariness he could not hide. "He spoke not only of me, he spoke of you. He said the dogs will devour you by the wall of Jezreel." For a moment, Jezebel watched him in silence, and then a cold, loud laugh filled the room. "Is that what he said?" she repeated, her tone laced with irony. "The same one who closed the heavens and fled cowardly when I threatened him. His words are nothing more than a breath in the wind. I am the daughter of Etbaal, priest king of Sidon. My gods have always protected me and will continue to protect me. Dogs. There are only lions in my courtyards." Months passed, and war once again knocked on Israel's door. Ahab, seeking glory for his name, decided to march to the battlefield. Even after the prophet Micaiah told him that he would not return alive, the king ignored the warning. In the midst of the battle, a Syrian soldier, not knowing whom he was aiming at, shot an arrow at random. The arrow found a gap in Ahab's armor, sinking deep into his side. The king died there, amidst the soldiers' clamor. His body was taken to Samaria, and the blood-stained chariot was left next to the pool where the prostitutes bathed. When the servants began to clean it, stray dogs came and licked up the king's blood, exactly as Yahweh had spoken through Elijah. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and the house of Ahab received the first sign of its downfall. When the news of Ahab's death reached the palace, Jezebel, still dressed in her queen's robes, remained motionless. Her hands, adorned with golden rings, trembled slightly, but her gaze remained firm. She remembered Elijah's words about Ahab's end. That phrase about dogs and blood crossed her mind like a chilling shadow. She locked herself in her chambers, weeping not with tears of repentance, but with the rage of someone who feels their pride wounded. Her tears sought revenge against everything the prophet represented. Jezebel ordered a great sacrifice to Baal to be prepared, assuring the court that her God would give them strength to avenge the king's death. The throne that belonged to Ahab passed to their son Ahaziah, an inexperienced and easily influenced young man whom Jezebel incited to continue the same evil practices. Finally, Ahaziah suffered a severe fall and sent messengers to consult the god of Ekron, Baal-zebub. But the Lord, seeing the stubbornness of their hearts, sent Elijah to intercept them with the message, "You will not rise from the bed you have gotten up on, but you will surely die." The divine decree was executed with precision. A few days later, the young king breathed his last. Jezebel, dressed in mourning, cried aloud, not out of repentance, but out of frustration at seeing the lineage she had tried to consolidate broken. Even amidst tears, her heart remained hardened. After Ahaziah's death, the throne remained vacant. Her brother Jehoram, another of Jezebel's sons, took power, and like a cycle that tirelessly repeated itself, the queen ensured that he also walked the same crooked path. Idolatry remained alive, and the shadow of Yahweh's judgment continued to extend inevitably over the house of Ahab. It was during a military campaign that Jehoram was seriously wounded. Withdrawing from the front line, he sought refuge in Jezreel. Jehu, a commander in the army, had been secretly anointed by a messenger from the prophet Elisha with a clear mission: to destroy the house of Ahab. With the fervor of the divine order, Jehu marched resolutely toward Jezreel. When Jehoram met him, he asked, "Is it peace, Jehu?" The answer was a blade that cut through the air. "What peace, while the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her many sorceries continue?" In that instant, Jehoram understood that this was not a diplomatic meeting. He turned his chariot to flee, but Jehu drew his bow, and with a single accurate shot, the arrow pierced his back and came out through his heart. Jehu ordered the body to be thrown into the field of Naboth of Jezreel, remembering the words of Yahweh given to Elijah years earlier. Thus the words of the Lord were fulfilled to the letter. Meanwhile, Jezebel, upon receiving the news, remained unshaken. In Jezreel, she still clung to the throne. Knowing that Jehu was approaching the city, she prepared herself like a queen who intended to face death with defiance. She painted her eyes with kohl, arranged her hair, and put on the most imposing crown she still had. She went up to the palace window, watching from above as the dust on the road announced the new king's arrival. Jehu entered the city gate with the same force with which he had defeated Jehoram. Seeing him, Jezebel spoke in a loud voice, full of mockery and venom. "Is it well, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Jehu, without responding to the mockery, looked up at the window and shouted, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs who had served her silently peered out cautiously. At that moment, Jehu gave a sharp and abrupt order: "Throw her down!" In a single motion, the hands that had once obeyed Jezebel grabbed her and cast her into the void. The queen's body hit the wall and then the ground with a thud. Blood splattered on the wall and on the horse's hooves. Jehu drove his chariot over her without stopping, as if she were a worthless obstacle. Afterward, Jehu went in to eat and drink. But then he remembered that she was a king's daughter and ordered that she be buried. However, when they went to look for her body, they discovered that almost nothing remained but her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The dogs of Jezreel had devoured her flesh, fulfilling exactly the word that Yahweh had spoken through Elijah. In the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh, and Jezebel's body will be like dung on the open field, so that they will not say, "This is Jezebel." With her death, the land rested from her violence, and heaven rightly sealed the last chapter of her story. However, the sentence did not end there. Jehu, zealous for the word of the Lord, exterminated the entire house of Ahab, leaving no male descendants, and destroyed all his relatives and allies. All this occurred as a direct consequence of the sins and corrupting influence of Jezebel, whose hands led kings and people to idolatry and rebellion against the living God. Her name remains an eternal warning that no pride, no matter how adorned with power and cunning, can prevail against the word of Yahweh.